Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission meeting of March. This is a formal meeting of Hackney Council and all the usual constitutional requirements of council meetings apply. Can I remind members and officers that this meeting is being held in public and is being broadcast live via the internet. The rights of the press and public to record and film the meeting apply, and everyone present should note that media representatives may be in attendance or viewing the live stream. Apologies for absence. I've got apologies for absence from Councillor Suso Runga, who, will she be online? Or she might be online, okay. Any other apologies?
Councillor Leelord Scott and Stephen Olale will be late to the meeting.
Thank you very much. There are no urgent items and the order of business is set out in the agenda. Item 3, declarations of interest. Do members have any declarations of interest? Jo?
Hackney School Governor.
Any others? No. In which case, we'll start with our first item, which is support for young parents. Following on from the disproportionalities in perinatal mental health from the 2021-22 work programme, the Commission agreed to review the support available to young parents under the age of 25 in Hackney. The aim of this session is to review the needs of young parents to ensure that this is being effectively met across local services, assess how services work together to support young parents and as well as their children, identify ways in which the local offer to young parents might be extended or improved. A paper is enclosed from Public Health and Children and Family Service, both council services which directly support or commission services to young parents. The report provides an overview of the range of support which is provided to young parents, including those who are care experienced. To support this scrutiny session, the Commission has also invited Kathy Ashley, the Chief Executive of Family Rights Group, who's joining us online. Thank you, Kathy. Family Rights Group is a national charity supporting children and families and which provides dedicated help, advice and support for young parents. Ahead of this meeting, the Vice Chair and I have held 2 focus groups with young parents in Hackney to understand more about their experience of being young parents in Hackney, the support they have received and what they think might be improved for other young people in their situation. We will talk about this briefly after we hear from officers. So for this item, we have Jackie Burke, the Group Director of Children and Education, Diane Benjamin, the Director of Children's Social Care, Laura Bleaney, the Head of Corporate Parenting, Sarah Brumfield, the Head of Children's Centres and Early Help, Carolyn Sharp, the Consultant in Public Health, and Swati Vyas, the Senior Public Health Specialist, and Kathy Ashley from Family Rights Group. So the format of the session, we're going to start with an overview of the support for young parents in Hackney by Carolyn and Laura and Diane, I think for 5 to 10 minutes, please. And then we'll move on to Kathy Ashley before summarising what we picked up from the parents that we spoke to in the focus groups, and then we'll have a Q&A with officers and Kathy. So handing over to support for young parents from our officers from Hackney, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'll start then. As, like you said, this paper was sort of provided in 2 halves. So the first bit just provides an overview of the services that are commissioned by Public Health. And then, if it's okay, I'll hand over to colleagues from Children and Family Services to give a summary of that section of the paper and then open to discussion. So the main focus of the paper, of the section of the paper provided by Public Health, basically gives a bit of an overview of the current services provided by our Family Nurse Partnership service and the justification for our decision to decommission that service and transition to an enhanced health visiting service. So we thought that that was the core kind of service that was targeted towards the cohort that we're interested in discussing today. So with regards to Family Nurse Partnership, as is described in the paper, this is a licensed program that's targeted towards mothers aged under 19 or up to the age of 24, where there are additional social and emotional vulnerabilities identified. So it is a licensed program, the FMP service, which basically means that there isn't any flexibility with regards to the service model. So to give you an idea of some of the restrictions that we have on that service, only first-time mothers are eligible, and those mothers have to be under the age of 25. The programme will only work with and support the first child up to the age of 2. The programme doesn't address and support concealed pregnancy, so you can't access the programme if you are more than 28 weeks pregnant. And like I say, it's a licensed model, and so there's no flexibility with regards to how that model is delivered. And so a decision was taken to decommission that service and move to an enhanced health visiting service, where there'd be an additional tier on top of what our current health visiting service looks like, which is going to be an intensive support service, which is needs-based. So essentially, that additional tier will be flexible and responsive to the needs of those who require it. So there's no age limit. So the client can be a young parent, but also can be older if they are vulnerable and require additional support. We also have, we have a high birth rate in Hackney, and so we are aware that there are parents that are vulnerable in their second and sometimes even third pregnancy as well. And so it will give us the flexibility to provide that additional intensive support to all those that need it, not just those that are having their first child. And pulling the service together as well with the health visiting service provides that sort of seamless support. So we understand that individual needs change over time. So somebody that is currently being supported by the health visiting service and then their needs may escalate can be stepped up into the intensive program. Likewise, somebody who is in the intensive program and doing well and responding well to the support can be stepped down if needed, and that can be a seamless transition. And if somebody, for example, doesn't want to be supported anymore with the intensive element, the handover will be more seamless and their data can be shared more easily. And we feel that that's a better and more holistic way of supporting individual needs. So those were the key justification and reasons for that decision. The FMP service will be coming to an end at the end of August 2023, with the new enhanced health visiting service coming into place from September. So there won't be any gap in provision. However, because we are decommissioning the FMP service, there will be, since between the date of announcement of the decommission and the new enhanced health visiting service coming online, the FMP service won't accept any new clients. And so that is something that I want to be transparent and open with, and so it's something that we need to work through and manage with our service providers. So unfortunately, anybody that would have become eligible for FMP between sort of the announcement being made, which was in October, and the new service coming online, which is September 2023, we are working with our universal services, so our current health visiting provider, and public health midwives, to make sure that those individuals are supported as much as possible. And anybody who's currently on the FMP programme will continue to be supported until a transition can be made to the new service. So we focused, like I say, the public health elements of the report on those two services and the justification, but I wanted to make sure that there was an overview of the other services that public health commissions in that report. So I basically put those in an appendix at the end, which just provides a bit of an overview of other services that are commissioned. So for example, we have a community-based peer mentoring, advice and support service. We're actually in the process of recommissioning that at the moment, and we want the new service to have a greater focus on peer mentoring. It's a really evidence-based way of supporting those who are socially vulnerable, supporting them to access the services that are available locally, build their emotional resilience, and also it's a good way for peer mentors to build their skills and emotional resilience as well. So that's a key service for this cohort. And we've also provided a bit of an overview of our young person's clinical health and wellbeing service, which includes sexual health support, support around pregnancy terminations as well. We also have a young people's substance misuse service and the pause service as well. And I can go into more detail about those if required, but in the interest of time, I'll hand over to colleagues from Children and Family Services.
Thank you very much. Apologies. So it's Gemma there, not Sarah. I'm here on behalf of Sarah Bonfield, who couldn't make it this evening. So in terms of the sort of children's centre delivery and sort of moving forward, developing into children and family hubs, as I've sort of detailed in the report here, the work with young parents is integral to what we do. So although there isn't a specific sessions or groups that are directed solely at young parents, they're actually supported through the universal services that we deliver within the children's centres. So I've put some sort of key data there into the report, and looking at that, about 11% of the parents that we're working with within our service are actually young parents. And most of those are accessing services via public health midwives, as Carolyn has just spoken about. They're coming to our stay and play sessions. And when they come to those stay and play sessions, we have very skilled universal staff that are working with them, identifying them. And if they need more targeted support, then they are referring them into our early help services. So from that, we've seen some real sort of success stories around families moving on to accessing adult learning classes, our young parents, sort of some of them going back into education. They're also taking their children to speech and language appointments over that sort of early identification of need. And they're also accessing some of the more targeted support, things like food vouchers and charitable items, etc. Many have come to our evidence-based parenting programmes. So I think certainly in my role, sort of visiting the children's centres and seeing the families that are coming in, supporting young parents is definitely a very sort of integral part of that. As we move forward, as you're probably aware, we are developing our service into sort of the wider children and families hub. That's very much in its infancy at the moment. We're currently engaging with parents across the borough to think about what that model will look like. Our main focus at the moment is around the Start for Life, so thinking about that sort of critical 1001 days, so supported by a health visiting service, to really think about how we provide that sort of universal and targeted support within that Start for Life offer. We haven't really expanded yet on what that might look like for 0 to 19 offer, but certainly the Start for Life offer will be very much focused on supporting all parents in the same way that children's centres do now. So, but I'm happy to take any further questions around the work of children's centres in terms of our work with young parents. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And in terms of statutory social work and the early help services provided to children and families services, similar to Gemma, really, there's universal services that we provide, and actually in the figures, the number of young parents is relatively low, represented in those numbers, and including the numbers of looked after children who are parents is low, which is good, and the number of care leavers who are parents are relatively low, and some of those care leaver parents have their own children involved in statutory social work, so we would provide a leaving care service to the parent, and then their children would have their own social workers. But again, that's relatively low, which is positive, which means the vast majority of our care leavers are successfully parenting. We've talked a lot before, but one of the biggest concerns about our care experienced children who are parents is housing and accommodation and moves. So we have a range of options for care experienced young people who are parents. So some will be supported in mother and baby foster homes. Some might have a residential parenting assessment if there's really high levels of concerns about their parenting, and we have a commissioned supported accommodation, which I think some committee members are going to see in Hackney, for support before parents are able to move on to their own independent accommodation. We've been doing a lot of thinking recently about how we can be the best corporate grandparents to their children as we can be. We had a visit from the National Advisor for Care Leavers last year who suggested that we do some work thinking about our specific offer to care leavers who are parents, so that's reflected in our updated local offer on the website. I think they signposted us, so good practice. We're really, really keen to open a care leavers hub in Hackney, and one of our top things we want to do is some kind of stay and play sessions, maybe leaning on some of our expertise from our children and families, children centres colleagues, because I think, and it was interesting in terms of the peer support, I think the peer support, the network of care leavers or parents, I think I caught up with them with some of the feedback. I think care experienced parents probably share a lot of the concerns that other young parents have, but also some of their own particular concerns about their histories with social care. So I think there is scope for developing that network. I think the other thing in children's social care just I would like to highlight is it's a perennial social work issue, I think, about engaging fathers. And we've been doing some thinking about how do we engage and support and encourage our care experienced children and our other parents in the system who are young parents who are fathers to be actively involved in the planning for their children, because they offer a huge amount potentially, but they won't offer that, and as do their families, unless we engage them in a way that brings them in and doesn't push them away, which is sometimes what happens with involvement with statutory services.
Can I just briefly ask, Laura, do you think there might be some young fathers who are parents, care experienced young fathers who are parents that we don't know about? Is it something?
I think absolutely there may be. I mean, probably there almost certainly is, and it's something that we really want to work harder on thinking with young men about the fathers that they want to be, whether now or in the future, and how we can support them to play proactive roles in their children's lives.
Thank you very much for that. Are we, from officer's side, we're all okay? Great. So then over to you, Kathy.
Hi, and thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So, great. So Family Rights Group, as mentioned, is a leading national charity working to ensure that children can live safely and thrive within their family, either with their parents, who may need extra support and help, or in kinship care with wider relatives or friends. And whilst I know that's not the subject of your focused discussion and scrutiny, I was reflecting on the fact that you will have young kinship carers, including sibling carers, within Hackney, and it's important that they also have focus support, because from our research, sibling carers, particularly and young kinship carers, often very isolated, very marginalised. Amongst as an organisation, we have also developed services and approaches which not only aim to keep children safely with their parents and their wider family, but also to strengthen the family and community networks of those children and people in the care system. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And we've pioneered innovative child welfare practices, including family group conferences. And again, I'll speak about that. And we are legal and policy experts in relation to children's social care. So not only do we service the all-party parliamentary group on kinship care, but we have also secured a number of legal changes in relation to the child welfare field. And we run a free specialist legal and practice advice services for parents and kinship carers involved with children's services. So one of the first points I suppose I'd make in relation to the services we can offer and the needs of young parents is, I would really encourage families that you're working with to know about our advice service. We've got an arrangement with the charity, the national charity Become. So where a care experienced young parent rings us where there are child welfare needs or concerns, we can also refer them to Become, and basically so that both organisations are providing support to that young parent or parent to be. In 2016, we conducted research into the experiences of young parents. And Sophie, I know that you are familiar with that research because you were involved in it with other hats that you have and expertise that you have in this field. And what it showed, and this was national research, but it showed that the needs and circumstances of young parents are often insufficiently and inconsistently recognised. And it is incredibly welcome that Hackney is undertaking this scrutiny. We also found that local protocols, service provision and professional practice often reflects limited consideration or understanding of young parents' experience or needs and how best to support them to keep their children safely in their care. Family Rights Group, as I said, not only provides an advice service, but we have, in response to that work, developed tailored resources specifically for young parents. And that includes a young parents advice website, which is part of our main advice website. And so it has a whole range of resources pertinent to parents to be, young mothers and young fathers. And I was reflecting on the fact that over 10 years ago, I undertook research into Fathers Matter and into the experiences of fathers, particularly young fathers involved with children's social care, and ran a number of focus groups in Hackney specifically about their experiences. And what was interesting at the time, and this is at the time, so this contrast, is that we were told that there weren't really young fathers around. What there were was young mothers, and they tended to be older fathers. So we advertised in the local paper and said, young fathers, we're really interested in your views, come forward, etc. And it was absolutely packed, the focus group, and really interesting in terms of engagement with services, particularly from their view. Their engagement was primarily one with the criminal justice system, the police, child support, but not with support services, not with universal provision. Not, they were seen and saw often universal services as alien or not engaging of them. In terms of, I want to go on to talking a little bit more about our specialist information advice and advocacy, because what we've often found is that whilst partnership working between parents and children's social care is key to ensuring that a child is safe where there may be a risk, we also know that often the child welfare system and processes feel incredibly alienating, particularly for young parents, that there are few high street legal aid firms in a position to take on cases. So there's availability of public funded legal advice is often very limited, either when child protection conferences are convened. And although I noted that your children's rights services do offer looked after young people who are parents advocacy in child protection conferences, I also noted that that wasn't sort of promoted on the website. And obviously it doesn't apply to those young parents who aren't care experienced. I would add that Family Rights Group a long time ago provided advocacy for families in child protection conferences in a number of London boroughs, and we are aiming to do so again. So it's something where, if that is something that Hackney is interested in, we'd be keen to talk to you about. One of the parents on our parents panel has written eloquently about being a young black father in the child protection conference, and he has referred to it as being a ghost in the room. That although he was present, he was not seen as a resource for his child. That only changed, as a result of being offered a family group conference. So it wasn't in Hackney, it was in another authority. And I think it is worth considering further around how family group conferences, which basically are aimed at utilising the networks of both the parents and wider networks. Sorry, unclear. The aim of family group conferences is basically to bring the wider network of the child to support the child to be able to be raised safely by their parents, and if that's not possible, to identify wider family and friends who potentially could raise that child if they can't remain at home. And for him, that was a turning point, because he was finally seen, and his family, paternal family, were actually seen as a resource. I also wanted to raise that on our advice line, we're getting still a lot of calls from parents where child protection conferences are happening remotely. And I think I'd like to ask the question, I suppose, in Hackney, whether child protection conferences are now all face-to-face, unless the family or parents actively choose for that not to be. Because certainly from our parents panel, we found that was often incredibly difficult to contribute online to child protection conferences. It was often very difficult to understand who was in the room, what was happening, how to contribute to information decisions in relation to their child. I just want to touch on two other points. One is that one area that we have found as being instrumental, both as an organisation and more widely, is having coherent structures for those with experience of the child welfare system to actually help design what services are available and what is offered. And I don't just mean in terms of focus groups, I mean actually structured engagement. So we've got a parents panel and we've got a kinship care panel, and our experiences that support that concentrated engagement of young parents particularly has really made a difference to the way that we run as an organisation, but also at a local authority level, we've seen it's made a difference to the way that services are commissioned, the way in which policies are constructed, the way in which families are talked about and referred to. One of the areas that we have been heavily involved with is the Born into Care study, which was commissioned by the University of Lancaster. And it basically has shown that the number of newborns subject to care proceedings has more than doubled in the last 10 years. Now, there is a big difference in relation to regional difference. So those authorities in the northeast of England much more likely for children to be removed or subject to care proceedings than those in London. But nevertheless, there are some characteristics of what we've seen that I think is pertinent. One of which is that young mothers are much more likely to be subject to care proceedings. their male counterpart, and they are more likely, if their child is removed, to be subject to recurrent care proceedings. And often domestic violence is a feature within those concerns. And domestic violence is the main underlying reason in our advice line as to why mothers contact our advice service. It's absolutely sort of dominates in relation to how families are involved by children's services and treated. And I noticed that in the report, domestic violence didn't get a prominence, and I think it is something that is worth the Scrutiny Committee looking at. There are new born into care guidelines that have just been produced by a range of partners, including led by the University of Lancaster, but including parents who are actively involved in the development of those guidelines. And if you haven't already, I would strongly suggest that you have a look at those guidelines. One of the things that comes through is how too often women are not being supported early in the pregnancy in order to give them the best chance possible to be able to keep their child safely. And again, it does recommend family group conferences as a way to be able to address that early on. And lastly, I just wanted to touch on our lifelong links work. And the reason I wanted to do that is, although the figures are impressively low in relation to the number of care experienced young parents in Hackney who are involved in child protection and looked after services in relation to their children, nevertheless, the question came in my mind, which is the same as Councillor Conway's, which is that often there will be fathers who children's services don't necessarily have identified as fathers. But secondly, we often find that young parents are very isolated, and the idea of lifelong links is to look at how you build relationships and support that young person to have a support network around them, because too often young people are separated from their support network, from their families, rather than that be built. But I've talked for long enough, so I'd happily answer questions.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I think we're going to move over to Councillor Gordon, who's going to summarise what the young parents that we spoke to had shared with us. It's worth me pointing out at this stage that this piece of work is about young parents more broadly, although we feel as a commission that we can add quite a lot of value in terms of care experienced young people in particular, because we are their corporate parents and have more greater proximity to them. But that's not to say that we're just looking at that cohort. And I think it's important to sort of reflect on what was contained in the report, but also what Kathy was expanding on. It's easy, I don't want us to think that we're talking that young parents' experiences universally are really negative. I think that the reason why we're here, though, is because if we have a look at the parents who, I think in the study that Kathy had alluded to about children who, women who are subject to repeat care proceedings, so their children have been removed repeatedly, or they've had subsequent children removed, if you have a look back, you'll find that they were invariably became parents quite young. And that, so if you don't get things right for the first child, then this is what ends up happening. So it's more about, we might be looking at really small numbers of people here, but these are people who, a bit like with the criminal justice system, you see coming back time and time again. And I think that if we know that young parents are overrepresented in these stats, if we know that care experienced young parents are overrepresented in these stats, then this is why we're here, and we need to make sure that we can ensure that we're doing all that we can to make sure that they don't continue to feature in those statistics. So handing over to Margaret. Councillor Gordon.
Thank you very much, Chair. So
just really to summarise some of the key findings from 2 focus groups that were held, facilitated by Hackney of Tomorrow, that were held online with myself, Chair, and Martin, and groups of young parents. I think they were, the vast majority of them, I think all of them were actually care experienced. And these young people had, you know, very kindly given up their time to support and inform the work of the Commission, and I felt they were extremely helpful to our understanding of the, you know, the experience of this cohort of parents. So although obviously all of these young mothers, and they were all mothers, had their own story and set of experiences, I think we were all very clear that there was a set of key themes and common trends that they wanted us to highlight. I think really sort of starting at the beginning of their sort of journey into parenthood, they all had expressed concerns and difficulty in accessing antenatal and maternity services. I think as has already sort of been indicated, they found some of these services intimidating. Several of them, were concerned about being judged. They also expressed concerns about whether these services were, sort of aware of how to support their own particular needs as young parents. And I do notice we've obviously very helpfully within the papers had, summarised the antenatal offer, and there's obviously, a service for vulnerable mothers, but I mean, it's young parents. One of our questions may be whether the needs of young parents are sort of met sufficiently within that service. So, I mean, in particular, I think there was, this sort of goes on really, I think, to maybe the sort of support they've had throughout their growing up in relation to the possibility of them becoming parents. One individual described how she wasn't aware of the sort of how many nappies to bring into the hospital, and how sort of, distressing and humiliating that was to have to ask for more shortly after having given birth. I think this is going to come to no surprise for anybody. Housing was an extremely key issue, and I think this was sort of reflected in the experiences of all these focus groups. Some young parents described multiple moves during their pregnancy and before birth, with little notice, including moves to accommodation they felt were really unsuitable, accommodation out of the borough. And this pattern, I think, continued after these young mothers had given birth. Some of them had been moved, to accommodation which was a long way from Hackney's, away from support groups, and this, and there was a universal experience that these, the lack of settled accommodation increased their vulnerability and sense of isolation. So, I mean, housing and housing support, I'm sure we're all in agreement about this, is absolutely key, I think, to the experience of these young parents. Another key theme was in relation to postnatal support, mental and emotional health. I mean, I think all these young mothers, described the overwhelming impacts of having given birth, and how that had impacted their mental health. I think that was a universal, near universal experience. And they also felt that they had limited opportunities for peer support, and none of them really described any support in sort of accessing their peers and getting those sort of networks, which, I think a lot of people would agree are key really for early experiences as a parent. In terms of, many of these young parents who were care experienced, still had their own social workers, described strong positive relationships with their individual social workers, although that was slightly mixed. I mean, I think there was, depending on the sort of individual characteristics of the social worker, I felt some young parents felt that their social worker was better equipped to experience and support them in their sort of journey into parenthood than other social workers. It was a universal theme, really, that the sort of demarcation really between them being social workers for, you know, the individual young parent who was within Hackney's care, and obviously not social workers for their child. But sometimes I think the young parents felt that meant they strayed away too far, really, from asking them about this sort of, you know, key experience in their lives and offering them appropriate support. I mean, we did also hear some lovely stories about a social worker offering to be a birth partner to the young person who was that she was looking after, and another social worker knitted a baby blanket for her, you know, for the baby, and they did send cards to congratulate the arrival. Going on to a couple of final points. I mean, I think this is in relation to sort of access to education and employment. And I think there was a number of these young people actually, I think, described how becoming mothers themselves, you know, sort of increased their sort of focus and ambition, you know, in relation to their futures, because they were now not only providing and caring for themselves, but also caring for their child. And they also, I think they described really sort of mixed experiences about the services they were provided in relation to their sort of particular needs in accessing education, including university education. A couple of these young people were still studying at university or graduates, and also accessing employment. And I think things that they did find particularly helpful was access to apprenticeship schemes, you know, I think in local authorities, including Hackney, and also the sort of possibility of managers supporting them in relation to their flexible working patterns, so that they could have help and assistance with childcare. So I think, yeah, so I think those were the main points. I mean, the chair and Martin may want to add some additional ones.
The only thing I would add to that was this, and this is unique to, I think, care experience young people, that they'd spoken about how their experiences of having grown up in care impacted the relationship that they had with services and how comfortable they felt raising issues with services. So we were hearing that if they felt that they were experiencing poor mental health, that they were quite wary of, which is understandable, isn't it? Because for those of us who've not grown up in care, you know, you see services as being supportive, and you don't necessarily link services to a trauma that you might have experienced and having been separated from your family, and, you know, so you can understand the complexities around that. So that was interesting for us, that a real barrier, which was also interesting thinking about when we did ask the questions at Health in Hackney about parents in particular of certain ethnicities accessing services, and the figures just weren't there. They just weren't accessing the services, despite the fact that the services were there and there was an offer available to people. So it's really important to sort of reflect on what these parents have told us about. Yeah, I feel like I'm having a hard time. I don't really want to tell anybody because I don't really trust that, you know, this is going to be received in the right way. So it's important to sort of recognise that as being a real barrier to accessing the services that people need. Thank you very much to everybody who's contributed so far. So I think we're going to just go to the Commission for questions, and if that's okay with everybody. I might kick us off, I suppose. I have a question around, it feels as though there's a lot that we're doing that is valuable and valued by the parents, and we definitely did hear that from parents. We definitely heard them say, my social worker did this, I did this really great thing. I suppose the challenge was that their experiences didn't feel as though there was any sort of consistency, and you can see the various different challenges that might come into play. Somebody might access children's centres in Hackney, somebody else might have been moved out of the borough to a borough that doesn't have children's centres. You can see how
it might be difficult to access the same services. But I suppose, do we have, like, given the complexity of the needs and the service response needed to support this cohort, is there a shared understanding of this need and service priorities of young parents? And where does effective oversight of the partnership of services which support young parents, where does that sit? Where is that? Who has that responsibility for that, in ensuring that we know that every young parent knows about the different services that are available? So that's my question. Do we have any other? If we take a couple at a time, if Councillor Tebbit-Deloff, and then you come in at the second round, please, Councillor Binny Lubbock.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, everyone. My question is related to PS provision that you mentioned in your presentation today, which also is or has been identified as limited from the focus group findings that which has been reported today. You said that within the provisions that you want to focus on peer mentoring support and emotional resilience. Can you confirm if this is a set objective for the new provisions, and elaborate perhaps, if you can, on how you plan to do it in terms of timelines and accessibility? I think it all goes back to, are people accessing and how we're going to do it? Thank you so much.
Yes, please.
I'm happy to kick off and answer that question first, if that's okay. Around the peer mentoring, it might bring in some other elements as well. I think it was really clear from the sentiments from the focus groups that there are barriers to accessing services around confidence, just knowledge and awareness, feeling, you know, and trust, I suppose, trust with those services as well. And so we have a community support services for vulnerable pregnant women and new mothers at the moment, but the current service only has a very small peer mentoring element to it. So currently they support about 35 women over a year. And they have other elements to the service as well. So we have a signposting element and a crisis support offer. So essentially, if somebody wants to phone up and talk to somebody on the phone, then that's available. And there's a lot of signposting into services. But what we felt was that we really wanted to bolster and enhance that peer mentoring element, because we know that, yes, you can say, oh, well, there's this service available to you and that service available to you. But without that trust and without that confidence to go and access those services yourself, those barriers remain. And so we wanted much larger numbers of women supported through peer mentoring. And so that's what we're aiming to do with the new service, which is currently being commissioned. So like I said, about 35 women are supported through peer mentoring currently. We want to get that up to about 180 per year, so a significant increase. Obviously that's not going to happen overnight. So I know you asked about timelines. The new service is coming in from September. There will be a mobilisation period where we have to recruit our peer mentors, train them up, make sure that we also want our peer mentors to look like the people that they are supporting. So we talked about, I think we touched on intersectionalities within this cohort. So yes, there's young parents that are vulnerable, but then you might have a young parent that is from an ethnic minority group, for example, and that's where your intersectionality and inequalities really come through. And so we want to make sure that our peer mentors reflect our local community, and it will take time to recruit them, train them up, and then match them with the cohort that is eligible. So the new service won't just focus on young parents. It's for socially vulnerable pregnant women and new mothers, but obviously young parents will be a key part of that cohort. It's all about building that emotional resilience, supporting with that confidence and trust. And you know, the peer mentors will have been through the process themselves, so may have been young parents themselves, will have had children locally, will understand the local service offer, hopefully will go with them for that warm handover on that first time they access services. So hopefully over time we're going to build up that trust element and really reduce those barriers to accessing key services for this cohort.
Sure. Thank you. That's really sounds very hopeful, especially because it's such a vulnerable stage for young mothers. The question is, since when will that start? How early in the pregnancy, and for how long after the birth of the child? Thanks.
So there's no, we haven't really set any parameters around that because we wanted it to be needs led. So, you know, so if you're pregnant, you can access the service. If you've given birth and you're a new mum, you can access the service. We haven't put a deadline on it, in terms of, you know, 2 years, 1 year. We've left it sort of quite flexible, so it's needs led.
I think just to make a point that I attended some training, I think recently about, I think Camden's been doing some work around peer mentoring, and that's just been reviewed by, I think, Bristol University, or one of the universities have just done the evaluation, so it might be helpful to sort of take any learning from their experiences there.
Jackie was just pointing out that I've just come from Camden, so I should be able to, yeah,
great.
take that up easily.
I'm a big fan of Tim Fisher there, but sorry, just a name drop, but he's great. Sorry, Laura.
Yeah, just to answer the question, I mean, oversight of young parents as a whole, I think is something maybe for our system to think about, because there's lots of people in private. For young care experienced parents, I think it is complicated by you know, a half, 2/3 of our care leavers at any one time living outside of boroughs, and it comes up time and time again in terms of the borough system, that people get different offers. But I think that I do lots of advocating these days for Hackney services extending their reach to care leavers who might be living outside of the borough, so that they have still a connection, because our hope would be that at some point they might be able to come back to the borough. We have the supported accommodation we provide is 8 self-contained flats, but with communal spaces, so they are a community. There's lots of parenting classes and things that they do there. So I'm very interested in the peer mentoring, and I will be following up with an email tomorrow, because I think there is scope in commissioning to say, I assume that's for Hackney residents, but can it be Hackney residents and Hackney care leavers? Yeah. And we've had some really good success with, say, the Hackney Wellbeing Network, who said it's for if you have a Hackney GP, but they very quickly turned it around and said, or you're a Hackney care leaver. So I think those sorts of things can bring some parity of offer and a more connection to Hackney as your grandparent borough. And I think I spoke to Ben, and I think he was really struck by the kind of care that he wants the leaving care service to take over being interested, enthusiastic, supportive as grandparents of the children of our care experienced children. And how can we do that? You know, buying birthday presents, sending cards, being interested, going to health visiting appointments, that sort of thing. And I think that's really helpful for our practitioners to hear, and just be a bit mindful about, they are the supporters of the parent, but anyone who becomes a parent, your child becomes your world. So you need to bear that in mind, and take that role really seriously.
On that point, actually, there was something interesting that came up for us from the parents. It was following on from that point that Councillor Gordon had made about the parent who had arrived at the hospital with she didn't have enough stuff for the baby, basically, and she said that nobody had sort of explained to her what she would need, and that she felt quite humiliated at that point. Was that, interestingly, and this had been my experience as somebody who'd been an advocate for young parents for quite some time, that care experienced parents are often told very much about what parenting shouldn't look like, because they've heard it in meetings in relation to their own parents, or potentially if they're subject to children's social care intervention. But prior to having children, they're often not told what a good parent looks like.
And that's across the piece. This is not a Hackney thing. I've never experienced that anywhere. So we do parenting courses, but it's often once you get to a stage where parenting is considered problematic and you've identified a problem. Interestingly, the parents said that they'd all be receptive to doing something. And these were parents who weren't subject to any intervention. And I just wonder whether there is any scope for us to explore looking at whether there is something that we can give access to, you know, some sort of a course, whether it's something that is run at the children's centres, because yeah, it felt really illogical that services, and this is not Hackney, this is across the piece, that we can tell parents that we're not sure about their parenting, but we've been their corporate parents, so we arguably had a duty to show them what being a good parent sort of looks like. So yeah, it would be great if we could see if something along those lines might be possible.
Sorry, can I just come in on that? Because I think in terms of supporting parents before they're parents, almost, I think is what we're talking about. I think as we're sort of approaching this broader 0 to 19 model around children and family hubs, I think that's be something to really focus on. And because I mean, even at the moment, our children's centres, we aren't just dealing with problem families or families that are needing targeted, intervention. We're offering that universal support, and I think that, you know, having that sort of broad offer at 0 to 19 level would actually give us scope actually to think about that in terms of how we can offer that support, linking in with Young Hackney and the work with secondary schools to sort of, might not necessarily be parenting classes, but I think something along those lines to link in for that sort of broader curriculum offer. And the other thing I wanted to pick up on was the sort of the early points about the leading on from the midwifery service to then access into more universal services for these young parents. Where that happens best is where the midwifery takes place in somewhere like a children's centre, because once the family comes in, and we've seen some really good evidence where the midwifery appointment takes place at the children's centre. So the family or the young person comes in, they're introduced to the children's centre, and they start to build relationships with the staff around that centre, and it becomes a familiar and safe place for them to come. And I was just sort of recently thinking about a visit that I made to Linden Children's Centre, where the public health midwife was there delivering, seeing very young, vulnerable women, but actually the staff that are in the next office, the family support staff, are linking in, talking to that wider multi-agency team and supporting that parent to come and access sort of broader services. So I think where you've got place-based services in things like children's centres, family hubs, it can work really well.
Say that also speaks to our ambition to get a care leavers hub, because it's that modelling. I just think about that example of that girl. If she'd have had others around her at the time who have had children, she would have known or spoken to the midwife. But our ambition is to get a care leavers hub where we can start modelling what good parenting looks like. And I think it is about having that consistency. And the way we get that is that place-based approach. So it's certainly an ambition of I and Laura's and Jackie's in terms of getting that care leavers hub. It's a starting point at least.
Thank you. Councillor Binny Lubbock and then Councillor Charlton, please.
Yeah, I was really interested to hear from Kathy, the family rights group, about what she was saying about young fathers and the difficulty engaging with services, and would be interested to hear any thoughts that she has on best practice. And I'm wondering if the team could also elaborate. It sounds like the peer mentoring isn't open to men, to fathers. So I'm wondering what kind of engagement of fathers is happening, and also more broadly how young parents and fathers as well are identified, engaged and assessed to be put in touch with services from across the local health and social care partnership, and how are these kind of reviewed and monitored. Obviously we've heard through children's centres that's one route, but are there other routes where people are sort of coming into those services?
Sorry, just one more from Councillor Charlton, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I also wanted to ask about parent effectiveness courses, but I noticed in the report you say 29 young people accessed an evidence-based parenting programme, and I wondered what that was.
So if I can firstly come in about the work with fathers. So part of the Start for Life programme, as we develop into children and family hubs, work with fathers is a key work stream within that. So it's something that we're very focused on. And we're going to be leading on best practice that is currently taking place at Isan Children's Centre, where they've done some really great work with fathers, engaging them at weekends. So that's very much part of the delivery plan within Start for Life. So we hope to develop that work further to engage fathers. In relation to the evidence-based parenting programmes, so we use a number of models across Hackney. So there are a number of evidence-based programmes such as Strengthening Families, Strengthening Communities, evidence-based parenting programme. There's the Webster Track and what's it called? What's it called? Yeah, no, the early years. Yeah. So so there's a number of programmes. So it's within our ethos of children-centred delivery, we only deliver evidence-based programmes. There are some challenges with that because they can be quite lengthy. So sometimes we'll deliver smaller interventions, which then lead parents onto those sort of longer 12-week courses. But if we're talking about an evidence-based parenting programme, it is a programme, obviously it's backed by evidence in terms of the outcomes and the impacts for those that attend the programme. Incredible years, that's the word I was looking for. It's just come to me, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think, Kathy, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just in relation to fathers' engagement. So the research that we undertook found that quite consistently, fathers' details are not recorded in relation to on child protection services databases in relation to whether they have parental responsibility, up-to-date contact details, how they'd engaged in the child's life, or if it's pre-birth, sort of what involvement had been taking place in relation to preparing them for fatherhood. And then, unsurprisingly, later on, they weren't therefore routinely involved in relation to decisions about their children. So when we were looking at what could be done and what could be different, one of the sort of models of good practice was a young fathers group that St Michael's Fellowship down in Lambeth was running, and one of the key sort of lessons around that was the importance of building trust and relationships and having some father specific work, and recognizing that actually it just takes time to engage. It wasn't about one-off parenting courses, it was about a consistent offer to those young men, and recognizing their strengths as well as potential concerns that they may have in relation to some of the reasons why children's services may have been involved with their families. In relation to peer mentoring, just to add that I know that Camden has had a sort of peer support in relation to it's not quite advocacy, but it is a sort of peer support system for parents involved in child protection conferences. And we're currently looking at how to basically develop consistent standards in relation to parental representation and advocacy. It is an area where I think, again, it can make a huge difference in relation to both young mothers and young fathers' engagement, in order that they're actually in a position to be able to contribute from a position of strength rather than what can feel like a very oppressive process.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I think Councillor Gordon. Oh, okay, Sidney's and then Councillor Gordon, please.
Hi, just to introduce myself before my question, because some of you might not know me. My name is Sudan Astop. I'm the young mayor of Hackney. I'm also the member of Youth Parliament for Hackney, and I lead on the Education and Youth Participation Forum there. My question is regarding your reports. When I read your reports, I saw like how many young parents access support from the council, from the stay in place sessions all the way to food vouchers being received. And about that, my question is about how will the council tackle the issue of Middle Eastern, specifically Middle Eastern and Asian young isolated mothers accessing these services? Because coming from a Middle Eastern background, I know how taboo this subject could be and how discouraged it is to be a young isolated mother, and these young parents do deserve our support. So I just want to ask how the council will be tackling bringing those support to Middle Eastern and Asian young isolated mothers.
Thank you, Sibnez. And then Councillor Gordon, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. I've got one sort of slightly related question to Sudanese and one sort of slightly different one. So the related one is, what do we know about the maternity leaves of young people in the Orthodox Jewish community, and whether they're any different from the wider community, and whether there are any sort of focus services for young parents in that community? My second question really is about antenatal services. I know obviously we're here with the public health hat on and we don't have anybody from Homerton Hospital, but what I do know is that there's very compelling evidence about the sort of positive impact of continuity of care on birth outcomes, including mental health outcomes, and also in relation to to levels of continuity of carers prenatally going towards postnatally, and that's something it's not always achieved by our services, because obviously services are commissioned from different places and have different purposes. But I just really wondered how much we can do as a local authority really to influence as much continuity of care as possible, so that so this particularly vulnerable group of young parents can maximise their outcomes by building up trusted relationships at a very earliest stage in their pregnancies.
I can try and start with answering these questions. So I think for your question around Middle Eastern young isolated mothers, and also picking up on your question as well around the Orthodox Jewish community, I suppose really it's ensuring that anybody, regardless of their background or their specific vulnerability, is picked up by universal services, and then ensuring that they are referred onwards and appropriately. And so that's what we're trying to do with our health visiting service. Okay, so that is it's universal in reach, but it's also targeted and provides that targeted support to those that need it. And so we've really tried to pull that through in the new specification, ensuring that we know the new provider is aware of the vulnerable groups, how to identify them, and the breadth of support and other services that can be referred into. So they will be picked up through health visiting and public health midwifery services, and then referred into onward support services as appropriate. And that happens through health visiting and our other universal services. I think your point on continuity of care is really important. There is data that shows that cohorts that are vulnerable, including young parents, have reduced continuity of care. I think our integration agenda and trying to pull services together will support that. So not having multiple services that people are battered between. So moving the family nurse partnership service into an enhanced health visiting service will again support that continuity of care, because it's the same provider. There's a step up and step down model, which we're really excited about, and we think that it's going to be a much more optimized experience and service for that cohort. Obviously, depending on the needs of the individual, there is referrals in and out of services which can reduce continuity of care, but it's all about trying to ensure that you build a trusted relationship and that individual stays with the client throughout their stint of care within a specific service, and trying to maximize that where possible. I don't know if others want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I'll come in, thank you. So I think in terms of sort of supporting more targeted groups or marginalised groups, the universal offer really for us is that using the health visiting service is our first point of call in terms of registering families with our children's centre or family hub services, and making sure that we are reaching out and inviting those families in. And we don't give up on that. We're very persistent on continuously making sure that if we've contacted families who've got their contact details from the health visiting service, that we are continually following up on that. So that in terms of continuity, that offer is the same for everybody who is, living in Hackney. In terms of the work with the Orthodox Jewish community, so we have one specialist children's centre in the north of the borough, Lubavitch Children's Centre, that work primarily with the Haredi community. In addition to that, we work with the JUMP organisation, so the Jewish Young Maternity Partnership, and they do lots of very targeted work with all of the Jewish community, but that includes young parents. In addition to that, we work very closely with Ezeli Eldos and Pikaholim, who are family support services that are working directly, and many of the women that we are seeing coming through in terms of that targeted work are young parents, because within the Orthodox Jewish community, parents are quite often quite young, so we are supporting them in that way. So there's quite a number of services that we're linking in with in terms of supporting the Orthodox Jewish community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question about moving from the Family Nurse Partnership to the Enhanced Health Visiting Service, and I really do recognise the limitations with the existing Family Nurse Partnership offering, and how it doesn't seem from the report that it's meeting the needs or doing as much as we would like it to do. I suppose what I wanted to ask is, so in the report we can see that Family Nurse Partnership can do up to 64 home-based visits, and these can be weekly, fortnightly or monthly visits, and this can go up to the age of until the child is 2. How close to that do we think this enhanced health visiting offer will be? Because in the report, I mean, I may have read this incorrectly, but it says in addition to the 5 mandated visits, the EHV service also comprised of 3 targeted visits. Is that around an additional offer? Because otherwise that would be quite a considerable difference to the Family Nurse Partnership offer.
Yeah, no, so the mandated visits and then the additional visits relate to the lower tier support offers. So for the intensive tier, so that's basically the equivalent of FMP, we've tried to leave it open so it's needs led. So FMP had a maximum of 64 visits. They were an hour each, and they went up to the child being 2 years old. We've tried to leave that open in the new intensive element of the health visiting service. So it could be less than 64, it could be more, depends on the need of the client. And again, it doesn't have to necessarily be an hour long. They could, if the client would like to have longer sessions but less of them, then again it's flexible. So it's a much more flexible offer, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be less support. It's just a bit more tailored to the individual needs.
What I would really like to see with this, because I think that there is a risk that we lose the focus for young parents and the expertise that we know the Family Nurse Partnership have. And I really want to see some assurances that we're able to sustain that expertise somehow, or to build it within the health visiting offer. But also, it lends itself to that focus being lost, because the focus is on vulnerable parents, which is a far broader group. And I think what we're seeing this evening is actually, although a lot of our services are really valuable, there aren't services that are exclusively for this group. And we're hearing this group saying to us, I was a young parent myself, so this is something that feels very familiar to me, how alienating it is to go into a space where everybody else is much older than you, talking about the new car that they've bought and about the new job and stuff, and you're wondering if you're going to be able to put your electric on your meter, and you're going through very, very different challenges. One of the parents, I was asking one of the parents if they'd heard of Care to Learn, and one of them had and another one hadn't, and that's a young parent thing. That's only something that relates to you if you're under the age of 19 and you've had a child. And if you have a general support offer that's for vulnerable people, is that lost? How can we ensure that we retain that specialist offer for those young parents, and it doesn't just get assumed within something that's a bit more broad reaching? And also on that point, to shape what that looks like, can we get young parents involved in what they would like that to look like? Because if this is something that we're saying could be an offering to young parents, can they have a seat at the table in sort of determining what they think that enhanced offer should look like for them?
You are right that it's really important. So the family nurses are, they've worked with young parents exclusively. So that's their expertise, it's their bread and butter. And they know exactly how to support this cohort well. And we need to ensure that isn't lost on the transition to the new service. What we want to do is to support the family nurses that we're providing FMP to 2P over to the new service as much as possible. We can't guarantee it, but we want to support that process so that expertise and knowledge and experience is maintained. We think that is beneficial for two reasons. Obviously, they will be leading on delivering the intensive element of the service, so they can apply that knowledge and expertise to supporting young parents, but other vulnerable parents, as we've discussed. But also they will then be subsumed into the health visiting team and can support and train up other health visitors that will be working with young parents that aren't necessarily vulnerable to hit that intensive support element, but actually will be supported by health visitors anyway. And so I think there's some element of peer learning and support that can be provided from those FMP nurses. So we think that's really, really important when we're really delicately and carefully trying to manage the transition so that the family nurses feel, they feel like they're valued, and that we want them to continue supporting this cohort. So yes, we do think that is really, really important. And your follow-up question, I've forgotten, sorry.
So it was just about, we always find on the commission that whenever we meet with young people, they've got the answers, that they can tell you what the challenges are and what they think some of the solutions are, and often it makes perfect sense what they're sort of sharing. So can they have a seat at the table in terms of determining what this, because they're losing a service that's just for them, and we need to make sure that they feel that there is that they have some influence.
Obviously, the new service model has already been developed and it's gone out to commission. So I want to be realistic in what they can inform in terms of the model is there. So the service, the bare bones is there. But what we can do is, and we've already started this process because we had a pre-meeting, didn't we? And we discussed how it was really important not to lose the knowledge of the family nurses, but also to get the experiences of the young parents that have been supported by FMP and build that into the new enhanced health visiting service. So we've actually already started that process and tried to engage some of the clients on the FMP service currently to capture some of those insights. But we also want to speak to the family nurses as well before the transition happens, again, to capture them some of those insights, and we keep what works really well in FMP and build that into the enhanced health visiting service as much as possible.
Councillor Gordon.
Yeah, I think, thanks for those responses. And I think one thing that was really clear from the focus groups was the sort of very particular experience that young parents had with sort of, navigating some of, possible sort of contradictions in the sort of, the challenges that they're facing in their journey towards parenthood. I mean, there was one young mother described how she had several housing challenges, so she'd had to move frequently and really sort of downsize the amount of belongings she had, which was again quite sort of emotional to her because she was a care experienced young person, and these you know, she had nowhere else to put these sort of heirlooms from her childhood. And the sort of tension between that, as well as the expectations of her as a you know, expectant mother to prepare for the birth and then acquire other stuff, equipment for the baby. So, and I think that was really, you know, thought very sort of vivid insight into the sort of how she felt that the conflicting pressures on her, you know, that were particular to her and her cohort, and trying to sort of navigate those things. I think it's, you know, it's very important that these particular experiences, I think, shape the services, you know, that, so, you know, so that, that the you know, the understanding of all that's, all those pressures is not lost.
Sorry, Councillor Woodley, I think you wanted to come in.
Really just to support that point around the value of co-production and ensuring that we're hearing those young parents in the room. There's been quite a lot of work, as has been sort of intimated, around the children and family hubs and looking at what we were describing as parent carer panels. In fact, they've said they would prefer to be described as parent carer forum. But I think to ensure that young parents are on those panels / fora would be a sort of a clear step to take. And I'm sort of thinking back to a single parent motion that we passed at full council, it must be over a year ago now, and just kind of ensure that we look back at some of the commitments made through that motion and make sure that single parents are part of that discussion as well. So I really, just in terms of takeaways and acknowledging some of the points made, I just want to support that point about hearing about that lived experience of perhaps some of the young people that you've been working with to pull your information together, would be interested in meeting with our colleague who has been putting together the design, the guidance for the parent carer panels. That could be a way to take a sort of a very definite and immediate step out of this meeting. But thank you very much for bringing this forward.
Thank you, Councillor Woodley. Did anybody want to come back on? Okay. I suppose I just had one. We're going to need to move on to the next item, but I did have one added thing that I wanted to put in about I suppose what this keeps coming back to is that we're sort of relying on universal services reaching a very specific audience, and it's a chicken and egg thing in that Family Nurse Partnership was open to everybody. So you didn't have to have a need, right? So it didn't need to be, you're the young parent who's really struggling, this will be for all of them. And we can say what we want about whether we think what they had on offer worked or not. But we're replacing it with something that perhaps doesn't recognise that being a young parent makes you vulnerable. And I'm saying that with all due respect, like as somebody who's been there, that you might need a bit of extra support around, you know, you're going through transitioning from education into adulthood whilst looking after a child, trying to figure out how to sort out your tenancy and to pay your bills and everything. It doesn't have to be a deficit model. It doesn't have to be around you're not coping, and you know, but how can we ensure that there is a continuity of service, that it isn't just that those parents who seem to be coping and they're living at home with their families maybe get the health visiting offer, and only the ones who seem to need anything more get the enhanced one? How do we make sure that them being young parents and what that means for them is recognised, and that we might have a bit more of an awareness to what that might mean for their mental health, for their education, for their housing?
Could I just say something for the value of universal services is they are there with the explicit remit of servicing everyone and identifying those who have additional needs. So we are absolutely reliant on the universal offer from midwifery, from health visiting, to be able to identify people who may need additional support. And we have no other way of doing that with parents. We have no automatic access apart from our children who are previously care experienced. We don't have any automatic access, so we are absolutely reliant on commissioning really good universal offers that are based on a needs assessment of what our community looks like and what the services providing that universal service will look like and who's making those up. And then we have a very rich, we've got one of the richest offers in terms of children's centres of most authorities in London. So we still have 20 children's centres, and we are developing a 0 to 19 child and family hub, and we're also developing hubs that are super youth hubs as well, which will also pick up young parents through that. In terms of the decommission of the Family Nurse Partnership, one of the decisions we took about that was because the evidence of how applicable it is to the UK population, because it was a model that came over from the States, the outcomes versus the spend were not there. So when we took the decision as a partnership to do the enhanced health visiting, so once again, we have the universal offer. The enhanced offer enhances it for all, but it also automatically assumes that young parents will be in need of support. So in no way is that being diminished. We are not being prescriptive. So this model was developed in the States. It was very prescriptive, as Carolyn said. It's a licensed model. And when you buy into a licensed model, you have to have absolute model fidelity. And what we know about our populations in Hackney is that the States cohort doesn't, it doesn't suit us. So with our this new model of intervention from the health visiting, we feel there's more flexibility, more scope to offer more visits or fewer visits, depending. We absolutely will not lose a focus on young parents. We also, we're very committed to young parents getting the very best out of their parenting experience and their children doing the very best they can as well, which again, part of our, if we are able to link them very directly into our children's centre and the strong offer that's there, and also the daycare, and the entitlement to the free 15 and 30-hour placements. That's part of a really joined up service. And I think we're really proud of what we've got on offer in Hackney. We can always get better, we can always do better, but the review of the Family Nurse Partnership was very much looking at, it wasn't hitting the spot, it wasn't delivering what we need for our young parents.
Thank you very much for that. I actually think that this is a good opportunity for all of us to be having this conversation at this time. And I don't want to for it to seem as though I don't recognise the value in universal services. I think it's in this issue, in relation to this issue quite specifically, just thinking about the conversations that we've had about young parents and mental health needs, I suppose it's just how do we ensure that a service that has been, for all its flaws, solely dedicated to a particular group, and I'm not entirely sure whether it was necessarily delivering on even what we were asking it to, but how do we ensure that that individualised focus on that age group isn't lost? When we're hearing, for example, from Kathy Ashley about domestic abuse and how that features for young parents, but we were also hearing from young parents, especially care experienced young parents, about their hesitance about going to the doctors in relation to their children, because they're always quite fearful about how things would be judged, their child had fallen over, how would that be looked at, and just about having those conversations and how different those conversations are for a particular cohort to another cohort, and how we have the opportunity now that we're introducing this in-house service to influence that, to capture those experiences from young parents and to shape a service that meets their needs in a way that perhaps Family Nurse Partnership didn't. But I'd just like to see that we can factor those things in. Sorry, Councillor Tevidoff, very briefly, and then we're going to have to move on.
Yes, it's not a question, it's just to add to what the Chair said. Thank you. Absolutely, universal support is just so brilliant, and Hackney does so well in this support in many areas. I think what it feels like now is that we are maybe at the cusp of potentially, we don't want to lose this tailored support that is for young people. And I just wanted to add from the mental health point, an element is that often young people can be looked down as well if they're young parents that are expecting, and they can face many judgments in society, and they will need a specialist support. They will need that additional tailored support for them. I remember as a young parent myself, I was often questioned whether I knew what I was doing, if I was myself a child, or type of judgments that makes you feel that you don't know. And it feels like if you're in a room or in a service where other parents will have other opportunities, you feel insecure. And that's what we try to help, that we avoid that. Thank you.
I just wanted to see if, Kathy, if you had any final points that you wanted to share, especially if you have any sort of ideas of best practice in terms of local authorities supporting young parents
if you wanted to share with us.
Yes, so funny enough, we were discussing this as an organisation today, and I mean, one example is what's happened in Hertfordshire. It's definitely worth looking at. It came out of the Lifelong Links work, but they have a specific service that is designed in relation to supporting, in this case, care experience, but care experience young parents. And I suppose just reinforcing the point that where young parents are actively engaged in the design and influence of services, it does help keep that focus in relation to ensuring that their specific needs are met alongside the wider sort of applicability of their experiences. And as an organisation, yeah, we've had experience working with local authorities in that sphere, but it was something that repeatedly came out of the young parents' research about both the generality of some of their experiences, but also about the specific, their specific needs, which often may not be factored in.
Thank you very much for that, Kathy, and also for everybody who contributed towards this item. I think there's quite a lot that we've taken from the various different meetings that we've had. So thank you also for those who've not just attended this meeting, but who we've met with outside of today. And I really do think that there are some good recommendations that we'll be able to pull together, certainly about how we can be better corporate grandparents, and in terms of having a local offer that is in part bringing together much of what we're already offering, but just ensuring that parents are signposted appropriately to them, and that we can ensure some sort of continuity of service from our social workers in terms of supporting young parents, and that they understand what our young parents would like from them. Yes, and also I'd love to see if we would be able to make some recommendations that might be able to have some sort of scope on helping to shape what the new enhanced health visitor offer. I know that it's already been commissioned, but I'm hoping that we might have a chance to have some influence on ensuring that the young parent voice that we heard these past couple of weeks is reflected in that service that will be targeted at them to a large degree. So thank you so much. Okay, so moving on now to the next item, which is item 5, pupil attainment and the attainment gap. The Commission maintains regular oversight of pupil attainment in Hackney, and this is therefore a standing item within our work programme. Children's attainment is presented at 3 stages for review: early years foundation stage, key stage 2 and key stage 4. The attached report provides a demographic analysis of attainment data to allow comparative assessment of pupil performance and the attainment gap between different groups of pupils. The aim of this item is to assess the attainment and progress of local children, to identify any gaps on education attainment among different groups, and by extension, inquiring how Hackney Education and local schools are working to address local gaps in attainment. Given the Commission's ongoing interest in children who have been excluded, the additional data on attainment of children in alternative provision is also included in the report pack. For this item, we have Paul Senior, the Director of Education and Inclusion. We have Jason Marantz, the Assistant Director of School Standards and Improvement, Anton Francic, the Principal Secondary Advisor, and Tim Woolridge, the Early Years Strategy Manager. We've got 45 minutes for this item, so can I ask officers to start by summarising key issues from the report? Just assume that we've read everything, and no more than 5 minutes, please. Sorry, because I've overrun with the previous item, so sorry. I don't think we should. Yes, Deputy Mayor Bram, remember to put your microphone on, otherwise those.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies for lateness. I think, you know, the data does show how well Hackney children are doing in comparison to Stickle neighbours and nationally, and on some levers, Hackney is first in the country for reading, writing and maths. I think there's also the positivity of what's happening in early years coming through, and particularly with children with SEND, and I know that particularly of a particular interest to Councillor Woodley. So in terms of others, we are doing really well. The data is showing that Hackney is positive, but that doesn't mean we are complacent, Chair, or that it should overshadow the challenges of how other children are still needing to improve. And thank you as Chair and Scrutiny for the critical challenge around how we improve those outcomes for other children. You know, it's really important that we still narrow the gap and that we are still laser focused on that while we celebrate the positive achievements of all our children. And I'll hand over to Paul Senior and the team to highlight on that more. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bramble. Colleagues, you'll see before you a very comprehensive report that sets out the attainment outcomes for Hackney's children across the early years phase, primary school phase, the secondary phase. Very comprehensive. You'll see from the data presented that actually Hackney compares very favourably with regards to our regional local authority partners, our statistical partners, as well as national partners as well. So it's not just about the outcomes, it's also those children who we're not doing as well for. But even with the SEND cohort, the Hackney outcomes compare quite favourably. I often say the excellence is within our schools. We're fortunate to have some outstanding schools in Hackney with some outstanding school leaders, several of here who are here tonight, which I'm sure hopefully their views will be welcome as well. So we've got some good stories, but that doesn't mean we become complacent. We're not complacent at all. And the ability to draw down, the ability to identify those groups where there is room for improvement. My team are very much aware of this. So I'd welcome the opportunity to bring in for a few minutes just to give an overview of their respective areas. Tim, would you be able to talk about the early years phase? Just give an overview, please.
Certainly, thanks very much, Paul. Good evening, Chair. Good evening, everyone. Can I give you a little bit of context about the early years outcomes data before I go through some of the headlines with you? The first is to say that this is the first set of data we've had since 2019, obviously because of COVID. But since 2019, there's been an introduction of a new early years foundation stage framework. That has meant the areas of learning that we've been assessing against have changed. The early learning goals, which are the statements which children are assessed against, have changed. Role of the local authority in terms of moderation has changed. So attempting to identify trends has been really difficult because we're comparing two different data types. And the DfE has encouraged us not to do that. But where we have been able to do that in the report, we have gone back to data up to 2019 to show similarities and differences from earlier data sets. So that's just something about the context. I'd also like to point out that early years is quite different from Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4 primary and secondary outcomes in that it includes, in this year's cohort, 406 children from the independent school sector. They're not reported on in primary and secondary outcomes. And that shifts the data a little bit. Those 406 children that are in reception classes in the independent schools are not all the children in reception classes and independent schools. They're just the children who continue to receive funding. In other words, they're the children who are born between April and August. So that's the term in which they turn 5 in reception class, so they're still in receipt of funding. This data set doesn't include all the children born between September and March. So the 406 children is just a snapshot of outcomes within the independent sector. So I think that's worth just having in mind. If you want a sort of ballpark figure of how many children are in reception classes in the independent sector, it's around about 1,000, probably 1,100, but we're only reporting on 400 of them. So just very, very quickly in terms of outcomes, yes, Paul and Councillor Bramble said outcomes are really positive. Outcomes, it's measured according to a good level of development. That's the percentage of children who've reached their expected standard is above national, it's above local outcomes. Significantly, when we slice the data, girls, boys, free school meals, EAL, SEN, those outcomes are above national and local benchmarks. Really significantly, the gap between free school meals and non-free school meals is 2%, whereas nationally it's around 20%. So something really significant has happened to ensure that those children eligible for free school meals have been uplifted. Same as the gap with EAL, it's there, but it's narrower than national gaps. And when we break down the cohorts in terms of their ethnicities, and we compare those ethnicities in Hackney with ethnicities nationally, all our ethnic groups outperform those ethnic groups nationally. That's the good news, but I will echo what Paula said and what Councillor Bramble has said. There is work to do, because when we look at our Hackney data set, some groups are performing better than other groups. Well, let's not shy away from the fact that we know it's very clear which groups are underperforming relative to other groups. We need to know who those children are, what schools they go to, and what intervention we're going to put in to support them in an ongoing basis. But we have a clear plan about how our ongoing support into that group is in place. So I think that's the kind of headlines from me, but obviously we'll get to questions after everyone else.
Thank you, Tim. Can I bring in Jason just to give an overview on the primary phase, please?
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Chair. Thank you all. And I'm probably going to begin the same way that Tim has, just to give you a little bit of context, if you'll allow me to do so, for Key Stage 2. So this group of children who lived through their year 4 and year 5 during the pandemic years, and also there was no testing during 2020 and 2021. Schools were asked to do their own assessment. A lot of them used old papers, previous papers to do so, just to inform parents for the purposes of reporting. But there was no formal national statutory testing. In 2022, what the Standards and Testing Agency of the DFE did is they announced that they were going to use the 2020 tests. So even though they're not standardized in the way that you would expect them to be, the level of difficulty wasn't altered. It was the 2020 papers used in 2022. And the aim was to see the gap. That's what the DFE and the STA in particular said. They were not intended for comparison, so no performance tables have been published this year. And all groups that use them, LAs, the schools themselves, multi-academy trusts, and Ofsted have been urged to exercise caution in using them, because the aim was to see the gap as opposed to anything else. As Paul and Councillor Bramble mentioned, the data in 2022 in Key Stage 2 is very pleasing for Hackney, but we are being cautious about it in the way that we've been advised to. And just to talk you through some of the key headlines, I know you've read the report, but as you're aware, 69% of pupils met what we call the expected standard in it's 3 subjects combined. It's reading, writing, and maths. Reading and maths are tested, and writing is teacher assessment through a moderation process, which is centrally dispatched and run through local authorities, which we provide as well. As you're aware, it's 10 percentage points above the national average, and it's 3 percentage points higher than the 2019 level in Hackney. Again, we're comparing with caution, but it is relevant to say that we're the one LA that bucked the trend. We went up from 2019 to 2022, and others did not. One of the reasons for that is that 2019 actually saw a bit of a dip in Hackney, to be really clear about this. But nonetheless, it was a tricky 2 years. Schools were very ambitious for their pupils, and it is a pleasing outcome. We're one of the highest performing local authorities in the country out of all 150. We're ranked joint 8th for the percentage of pupils achieving the expected standard in all those subjects combined, as I said before. And on individual subjects, we're ranked 16th for reading, 4th for writing, and 19th for maths. And at the higher standard, what's sometimes called greater depth, or working above the expected standard, we are above national and in line with London, whereas in 2019, we were below London and in line with national. So again, just sharing that. As you've seen from the data shared, in a lot of those key groups, disadvantaged pupils, EAL, SEN support, and children with an education, health and care plan, they outperformed their equivalent national cohort. on that headline data, that reading, writing, maths combined. And as you're aware, there are some of the ethnic groups also outperformed their equivalent cohort nationally. One that didn't is Indian pupils, and interestingly enough, that group also underperformed in 2019, although that gap has closed from 11 percentage points down to 4. And we are learning more about that group. It's about 97 pupils spread out across schools with the highest groupings of only 15 pupils, and we're having individual conversations with those schools. Caribbean pupils and Turkish Kurdish, Turkish Cypriot pupils, and I just want to stress we don't have a comparison for Turkish Kurdish, Turkish Cypriot nationally because that group isn't you're probably aware of this, but that group isn't looked at nationally, probably due to numbers. But they have the lowest proportions of pupils achieving the expected standard in reading, writing, maths when compared to other groups in Hackney, but the Caribbean pupils not nationally. So I'll stop there. Those are the key headlines.
And lastly, can I bring in Anton to give us an overview of the secondary and alternative provision phases, please?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. Following the previous speakers, beginning, of course, with Councillor Bramble, the picture at Key Stage 4, as with other areas, remains favourable regarding GCSE outcomes. And again, just to emphasise, we can compare 2022 with 2019 and not with 2021 and 2020, because although systems there were about teacher assessment, the system in 2021 was based on teacher assessment, and then the year before it was based on centre assessment, so they weren't the same, so we can't compare like with like. That said, in Hackney, whilst we were expecting the disadvantage gaps to widen, they didn't widen in the borough as much as they did nationally. In fact, in some areas, they closed marginally. Key points: GCSE outcomes on all measures, that's attainment 8, progress 8, standard pass, and strong pass in GCSE English and mathematics exceeded the national average. Nearly 3/4 of our young people finished Key Stage 4 last year in Hackney achieving a standard pass, and 56% gained a strong pass in GCSE English and mathematics, preparing them for further education, employment and training and their next steps in their lives. As a borough, as you've heard before, but you can see on page 33, our performance as an education provider remains in the upper quartile. Our cohorts outperform their national peers, and the cohorts I'm looking at, and it's there in the data, are boys, girls, SEND, disadvantaged pupils with English as additional language outperform their national peers. Generally, the gains made in Hackney match those that we've seen nationally. So given that we were above the national before, we remain above the national, and in some areas gaining more ground. The areas of focus we've identified in looking at the data and having conversations with education leaders concern the following aspects. One is about closing in-school gaps, and that's concerning boys' disadvantage, ethnicity, and ability. I'll come to ability in a moment. We're also looking with schools at the use of additional funding, the way people premium, and more recently, the recovery premium, as it's now called, how schools are using that in conjunction with tutoring, and just ensuring that that additionality is actually hardwired into the school's curriculum and the way it approaches teaching and learning. And we're also looking at intervention, with the key resource for intervention actually being the expert, the teacher, or the additional specialist. In Hackney, SEND, prior attainment, and disadvantage, those attributes, characteristics, have a greater bearing on outcomes than ethnicity and EAL. For alternative provisions, there's a positive picture there showing outperformance against the national. And that standard pass, the 53 pupils outperformed their national peers. In fact, I think it's 3 times if you look closely at the data. And finally, going forward, what we've learned from the conversations, probably more from that than from the data itself, is that the curriculum is the tool for improvement, the tool for advancement and developing engagement and improving outcomes, providing choice and opportunity. Also going forward, it's engaging with schools and looking at the development of leadership and culture. And by that, it's working with the schools to improve diversity in the workplace and diversity in the workforce, and subsequently diversity and representation in the curriculum. You'll know, or you would have heard about the initial work that we've started on the charter. So we're working systematically to kind of build shared values. Also going forward as a service, this isn't just secondary, this is right across the board. It's about developing the partnership and collaboration, meaning education, health and care kind of working cohesively and connectedly to improve the outcomes together. It's about also developing, in an earlier life, I would have said targeted work. It's actually creating bespoke work with the schools, advancing things like the Hackney Diverse Curriculum, looking at attendance, looking at the quality of education, looking at catch-up, and more recently, beginning some important work at developing the engagement of parents in improving the quality of education, so making the system as fair as possible. I think I'm going to leave it there. So I didn't want to blitz people with too much data. You've got that in the pack, and I just kind of wanted to carry on with the message that there are positive outcomes, but we're mindful that we want to guard against being complacent. We're not, and there's further work to do, and there's also continuing work. There are many schools that have started some important work, and we want to support those schools consolidating that and spreading their best practice across the borough. Thank you.
Anton, Jason and Tim, thank you. I think colleagues, you will have seen from the very comprehensive report, I think it's a 50-page report, they've really invested significant energy and time and resource in producing this report. The Hackney education system, through the work of our schools, are subject to regular interfaces with the regulator, so we come under scrutiny several times each week in terms of the challenge from Ofsted as well. So you've got a comprehensive report. Our schools are high performing, high functioning, and the results don't lie either. The outcomes for Hackney's children and young people compare very, very favourably. And whilst we have many reasons to be cheerful, we're not going to get complacent, because we identify certain groups. There is scope for improvement, and we need to drill down, and we need to do more. We need to do more. There are plans and processes in place to remedy that. Colleagues would have seen from the report and would have heard from the team that they're aware of the strengths and they're aware of the areas for development, with plans and processes in place to address those gaps.
Thank you very much, all. And just to say that I think we all recognise the progress that has been made and the sustained progress of our children over the years, particularly those of us who've lived in the borough long enough to remember when things were not like this. So just to say, because I know that many of our questions will most likely be focused on the gap and trying to bridge that gap, I just hope that you recognise that that's because we're here to try and see if we can have those conversations about how we can improve services. So I don't want that to come across as that we're not recognising the efforts that have gone into the majority of our children attaining to the level that they are. Commission, do we have questions? So we have a question from Sudanese and then Councillor Gordon, please.
Thank you for your report and your discussion. I want to speak about the Black Caribbean, Black African, Turkish, Kurdish and Cypriot groups as a Turkish representative. You know, looking at the report, it was shown that Turkish, Kurdish, Cypriot groups specifically were one of the lowest attainment groups in Hackney. But I do want to bring attention to the fact that these communities are usually the most in poverty in Hackney as well. You know, the report referred to the pandemic, and as a Turkish young person during the pandemic studying in A-levels, many of us come from overcrowded housing. Many of us don't have independent places to study. This laptop itself was provided by my own school at the time. We didn't have the technology. So these things really affect our education. I wanted to ask about how does the council aim to support families and young people who are from overcrowded housing, specifically from these groups, where this highly, affects their education. Thanks so much.
Councillor Gordon, please. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. I think what Susan has says really is the key question this evening, and I think I congratulate her on how eloquently she's put this. I mean, I was going to ask something similar really about the sort of intersection between various indicators of poverty and attainment, which is something that, although we very, very much welcome the detailed statistics, I think it is not covered. I don't know whether there's any possibility of drilling even deeper into the figures in relation to identifying how poverty, including housing disadvantage, affects our children's entertainment. Just to sort of build on that a little bit, I will say that, as the Chair has said, I sort of fully acknowledge the achievements of Hackney education. I know from my own family's history, the really, sort of transformative, how it can transform an individual and their family's experiences to do well in school and to obtain good qualifications, which are really, really important to many life opportunities. And that is the experience we do understand the majority of Hackney's children. However, I've been on this commission for, a number of years, and having looked back, we've seen this data or similar data in relation to this attainment gap for a very sustained period of time, and it appears really that the performance in terms of these groups has been stagnant, with the attainment either falling or staying the same. For example, in 2016, I don't expect you to have these figures at your fingertips, 57% of Black Caribbean boys and 78% of Black Caribbean girls achieved a good level of development at the end of early years. But in 2022, the equivalent figures have fallen. I appreciate, it's a relatively small percentage, but I'm just really wondering is, what are we really going to do about this ongoing attainment gap, and what plans and strategy do we have in place across our schools, to close this very, very long-standing problem, and how does that intersect with the council strategies in relation to anti-racism and the Black Man's Project and other resources like those?
Before I invite my colleagues to come in with their views from their particular parts of the system, we welcome the challenge. Richard, you must be very proud of Susan as coming from your part of the world, and she presented incredibly eloquently then, a really good challenge, a good advocate, a real good advocate for the education experience at the Urswick School. It doesn't surprise me, Richard, but Susan has a really good point with regards to how we're working with these communities where the data tells us there's a significant challenge and they're the most vulnerable and most at risk. And there's an overlap with Councillor Gordon's query about the outcomes for those particular groups and closing the gap. And I think you've heard from the team today, and I know you'll have read the 50-page report that sets out that the attainment gap actually Hackney is performing significantly better with most other local areas nationally in the closing of the attainment gap. So even though we're performing significantly better than other local areas in the closing attainment gap for those disadvantaged, we're not complacent. So we welcome challenge. And the reason we welcome that challenge is that we know there's more to do. On May the 5th, I haven't announced it formally as yet, but I'm going to be organising a summit that's going to be taking place at the Tomlinson Centre, where I'm going to be bringing together as many education system leaders and partners to talk about the work of the Hackney Education 2030 strategy, how we go about shaping and designing that. And a number of the strategic things we'll be looking at achieving world class and best in class. And one of those will be looking at closing the attainment gaps. Councillor Gordon, I'd welcome your input into coming along to supporting and challenging that, because clearly you're an advocate and passionate about that agenda. No one has all the answers at this juncture. I'm not going to get complacent by saying that our data tells us that we're actually outperforming nationally and regionally and locally in this space, because we recognise there's more to be done. But, I used the line at the head teachers conference on Friday: unless you seek perfection in everything you do, you never achieve excellence. Our bar is there. That's where we're seeking to go with this. Your input will be welcome, Councillor Gordon. Coming back to the views on that particular community, we're looking at data, we're looking at groups, we're looking at disadvantage. We will drill down, rest assured. Tim, from an early years perspective, any thoughts in response to what Sudanese and Councillor Gordon have said?
I completely agree with the questions that you're asking. Black Caribbean, Black African and Turkish Kurdish Cypriot children are underperforming relative to their peers in Hackney. Why is that? What are the factors that are affecting that or contributing to that underachievement? I think you've identified some of them. They're to do with housing, they're to do with employment, they're to do with parent education outcomes, they're to do with overcrowding, they're to do with access to technology, they're to do... I completely agree with you. They are factors which are affecting outcomes. I also think that some factors affecting outcomes are around, certainly when you read the academic research on what are the factors affecting poor outcomes, it's to do with low expectations. It's to do with ethos that exists within schools and settings which doesn't necessarily support certain communities. Leadership, expectations, parental involvement, effective partnerships. Are they all in place? Are they where we want them and how we want them in Hackney? Are we really focusing sufficiently on a curriculum for these children here? And the answer is, well, we're obviously not doing something right, because those outcomes, as Councillor Gordon identified, haven't really shifted in the past 5 years. I think we are doing something now. I think we are addressing things, and I think we will begin to see the impact. In 2021, in early years, we had a huge focus on trauma and attachment, because we know that trauma and attachment is a key indicator on outcomes. We had a huge focus on self-regulation. That was partly driven by the change in the curriculum, that children are now assessed at the end of the foundation stage on the extent that they can self-regulate, executive function. So we had a huge focus on that, and that linked to trauma and attachment. We've now shifted our focus on to trying to create across our settings an ethos of anti-racism, developing leadership and developing a diverse curriculum, ensuring that the resources that we've got in settings match the children that are going to those settings, that we have books, that we have resources, that we have materials, and that we respect the culture which the children come from, that we develop really effective partnerships with parents so they, as co-educators, are fully involved. Now, this is an ongoing piece of work, and I don't think we're going to see the impacts of this for quite some time, but certainly it's recognised, certainly it's been taken on board at a children education level with a focus on systemic anti-racist and trauma-informed practice. Sorry, I can see you want lots of follow-up questions.
That's okay. Sudanese, did you say follow-up also? Yeah.
Regarding parental involvements, I'm a Turkish young person myself, coming from a second-generation immigrant family. Not a lot of parents within our community actually know English. Language is a huge barrier in our community. As a, leader in my community, I'm one of the only people in the Hackney community that actually brings the council support or council news to my community, for example, through social media, through my own network of Turkish people in Hackney. So I would suggest maybe get in touch with schools to make sure that there is at least one Turkish person, a leader within their school, to speak Turkish and involve parents within these events to support young people and support students. There was one in my old school, so that really helped. Also, I just wanted to say, if you're saying, oh, what is it, why is this happening with my community and everything, I would highly say definitely get in touch with me if you have any questions, because I do lead in my community. I speak to many young people, I speak to many parents. My own family is quite well known within our community as well. So, I would love to work with you on this, because it's a passion of mine to bring the young people of my community up in the attainment as well. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Chair, can I come in on that?
Sorry, my very brief follow-up is can Hackney learn from any other local authorities who've changed similar attainment gaps?
Officers.
I bring in Jason. Wow. Sudan's outstanding. Please don't tell me how outstanding Richard and the Oswick experience is. I already know this. Okay. But that was simply outstanding. Thank you so kindly for being such a good advocate and presenting so well and bringing that challenge as effectively as you have done. Can Hackney learn? Jason.
I'm actually going to allow Anton just to address that question, and then I'd like to come back on your point, because we're running a really interesting initiative I'd like to share with you.
Okay, going back to the previous speaker and earlier, we can provide detailed and forensic analysis of data that won't necessarily kind of move you further forward looking at the intersectionality. But what we know is that the development of strong relationships with families and with the community, and also collaborative approaches with external services helps, and it's that mixed. What that's about is helping schools on their journey, and their teachers and their leaders, and that's for me is about growing. Is a strong understanding of what it means to grow up a disadvantaged pupil in an area of disadvantage. What does that present itself in a school and in the classroom? And I'll tell you how. In the ability to self-regulate, in vocabulary, in disposition, in confidence, or at the other end of that, it could be fear, cultural capital, etc., etc. In parallel with that, there's also the same to develop a strong understanding of the lived-in experience of some of our children and what the system, how that plays out in its unfair way on those. And so that is about highest expectations. That's also about having a curriculum where there's a focus on curriculum equity, not simply and singly excellence. And going back to the question, what do we learn? When we look at the schools that have broken the odds and looked at other boroughs, not just in London, Oldham, Derby, looking at the research there, those two are opportunity areas. So we know it's within a school and across an area, it's critical that there is a consistent understanding of the strategy. Whatever your strategy is, as a borough, as a school, it needs to be understood in your school and lived in all aspects of the school. And we also know that the schools that break the odds do small things exceptionally well. Engaging with parents, getting an interpreter, providing hot meals, welcoming students, and providing a listening, a genuine and an authentic listening space for the parents, for the pupils, and also for their staff too. So any strategy, as I said, kind of needs to kind of come to life in a school. And finally, this concept that I mentioned earlier about the teacher or the specialist or the additionality, actually that's the intervention. You get away from this thing. It's the child's fault. Nobody has to be, given the gift of disadvantage, if I can call it that. We have to support schools at developing ways in which they can, break those barriers, and that's not going to come from data and data analysis alone. It needs what I call a frontier approach. I'm going to hand over to my colleague.
Thank you. I just want to share we have a program in the primary phase. It's part of a Raising Achievement grant, which is given by Schools Forum, and it's currently running, and it's a bit of a trial because we started in 2018, but because of the pandemic, we had stops and starts. But it's 4 programs aimed at raising attainment for the key groups we've been talking about: the Black Caribbean children and the Turkish Kurdish, Turkish Cypriot children. 2 of them are centered around the youngest children in the primary phase, so year 1. And what we do is we ask schools, we identify them through data, through conversation. Some of them come to us as well. And we ask them to identify pupils from those groups that would benefit from one-to-one daily reading support. And I'm smiling because we have some really good in-year data. This is the first year we've been able to do it properly since the pandemic. Last year we did some of it, but we had to move it online, which didn't have the same dynamic. Coupled with that, we started running parent workshops in these schools. We don't run them, the schools run them. It's a train-the-trainer approach. So one of our reading specialists is working with schools to run workshops for the parents, and ideally of the same children receiving that support, but that net can be cast a bit wider. So we're able to look at that data at the end of the cycle. We have come across the language issue, the interpreter issue, so any support you can give or signpost us to would be helpful there. And also some of those parents don't feel comfortable coming into school, but ones that are starting to engage, that's been a real positive. We couldn't run that during the pandemic, so what we did is we actually just sent books into homes. And where we could find books in other languages, we did that too, just to encourage literacy. So that was a bit of an attempt to try and bridge that gap. We also, the other two initiatives, one is a maths in year 5 and a reading, we call it, it's like a book club, a reading group for years 4 and 5. And we're really trying to make that as interesting and encouraging for the children as possible, choosing texts that would be of interest to them, appropriate to them, but also use the funding to bring in author visits to really excite children in the area of reading. In addition to that, we've got a parental engagement system leader who's just, we had one, Deborah Robinson, who's moved into the wider role at working on the anti-racist charter, but we've just got a new parental engagement system leader who'll be working with us in these areas and allowing schools to identify themselves, but also having the team identify schools. So we can speak more about this after this year's cycle, but we are trying. Some of it is about trial. It's about looking from research, talking to schools, and then learning from that.
I think we've got Jackie and then got quite a few questions from the Commission. If we can try and be brief so that we can try and get as many people in as possible, please.
So I'll be brief, but thank you, Chair. I think the key word that keeps coming up is system, and it's about system leadership. Because there's no one solution to the really excellent questions you posed, Susan. There's no one solution to that. I'm really proud of the changes that with Jason and Paul's leadership that the school improvement team is making to widening their brief. But as Jason said as well, we now have Deborah Robinson as the diversity and inclusion systems leader, which she liaises across the whole system, but also works with the internal education, the Hackney education system, and with her is the parental engagement systems lead as well. So what we do know is we've got some really entrepreneurial heads. So you've got your laptop because you've got an entrepreneurial head. We know across our school system we've got great entrepreneurs, which Hackney education leaders are bringing together so that we can share that more. Absolutely delighted with your offer of support, Sudanese, and you guarantee, we will take you up on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I have Richard and Joe, and then we'll have another round of questions after.
Thank you. I want to support your first point, which was actually you talked about overcrowded housing and poverty of employment. And the school that I have the honour to leave has the highest levels of deprivation in London if we're talking about eligibility for free school meals. We're a scrutiny commission, and I don't think the officers here could possibly answer that question. But what does that say about our provision of housing and employment opportunities for a particular group of our populace, including a particular area which is very much at the centre of Hackney? So that was my first thing. The second thing is I really welcome what Jason said, because if you study back the history of Hackney education and the improvements that were made, they all started with early years work. And if we look at your data, which I think is excellent, some of the best data that's ever come before this commission, what you see is that the gaps that are established at primary level
perpetuate through the rest of the school system. So again, as a bit of challenge and scrutiny, what are we doing to make sure that we're putting every possible piece of investment we can into early years, and particularly into those disadvantaged groups in early years? And just a final one, over the last few weeks, Urswick has raised nearly £1,000 for victims of the Turkish earthquake fund. I have been stunned by the reaction of the community to that. You know, I've had people coming up to me and shaking me by the hand, and just thanking me and all the rest of it. And all we've done is held a couple of events that have generated some money, given, of course, by people who generally haven't got very much money themselves. But one of the things we could be doing is asking what the council has done in terms of supporting that community, which is grieving in this country and is absolutely struggling for its life in Turkey. So what's the council done? And equally, let's collect other good news stories from other schools who I'm certain have done other things in response to the Turkish earthquake. And let's actually make sure that the community understand the response that we have made, because we actually want people to be with us. We want to build relationships, and one of the ways of doing that is by raising money for the victims of the Turkish earthquake.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry, can we take a question from Joe before we?
My question, I suppose, relates to the fact that all of the data that we're receiving is aggregated across the whole of Hackney. And I'm wondering to what extent there is a disproportionality between different schools in each phase, and to what extent, well, what work has been done to share best practice, things that are working, what are the factors that are working in the schools where there are smaller gaps, and how that work has been disseminated. And in a similar vein, I suppose how we are trying to build on the positive work that has been done in the early years. And whilst we know, Richard, that gaps that appear there are perpetuated, we also see that work that is done in early years is lost as children move up through the phases. And it's how do we try and translate some of the work that is probably easier to do in the early years in terms of it's more child-centred, there are less external accountability measures putting huge pressures on schools and so on. But that's the challenge, isn't it? How do we extend those things that we know? We know it's about relationships. We know it's about an understanding of, you know, regulation and behavioural practices in schools, school culture, a culture of belonging, a culture of inclusion. And all of those things are much harder to achieve as you go through primary, and then even more so at secondary level.
Thank you, Joe. Before I invite Tim to come in with his thoughts on the early years phase, I often say the excellence is within our schools, Joe, and I'll say it again, the excellence is within our schools, and it's how we create those partnerships, how we create those forums, how we bring our system leaders, our networks together. Anton's bringing system leaders together, Jason is, and Tim is. Consistently, that's what we do as a local authority. Our role is to broker those partnerships, to identify what works, create an environment where we can share that good practice, and that would be a failure as a local authority if we didn't do that. Identify what works, is having an impact, so it's not just the anecdotal stuff, the data tells us it's having an impact, and showcase that. We have our head teacher partnerships, we get head teachers to come along and showcase what works. We have our network meetings, we're getting our Senkos to come together to share practice, compare practice, share what works. Does it go far enough? Absolutely not, and we could go further and we could go faster, we get that. But we're trying to create an environment where the excellence is within the schools, we're showcasing it, we're shining a light on it, and we're making sure that each one teaches one, that all of the other schools are aware of what works as well. So we're very keen to develop that sector-led improvement approach. Identify best practice, identify practice that's having an impact, showcase it, share it during our bulletins, share it in our teacher meetings, share it during our network forums and opportunities. So absolutely, that's the model we're trying to build on, sector-led improvement, identifying what works, cascade, share it. Tim, regarding the earlier space, and then Jason after Tim.
Yeah, just a couple of things about the early years, if I could. I completely agree with you. It is far easier to put systems in place in the early years. You see parents at the beginning of the day, and you see parents at the end of every day. So to have that kind of consistent language, parents are asked, how are you supporting your child at home with this? What can I do to help you support your child at home? Developing those partnerships, every setting's got a linked health visitor. We have integrated 2-year-old progress checks and integrated reviews, and that's really helpful when it comes to kind of getting everyone working together. And I think it is difficult to sustain that as you go through primary into secondary. I think I'm very happy to take you up on your support with regards to the Turkish, Kurdish, Cypriot community. One of our challenges is a long way before the children are 5. It's about making sure parents take up their free entitlement offer from 2 and then 3 and 4. And we know that only 72, well, actually in relative terms, that's higher than every other local authority, but it still means that almost 30% of our eligible 2-year-olds are not taking up their free entitlement offer. And that has an impact on outcomes. So when we look at outcomes data and we say, what is the impact? If you were a 2-year-old and you took up your entitlement, then the evidence is there that it's had an impact. And if you were a 2-year-old that didn't take up your offer, then that can be mapped through. So that's a really key area that we need to work on. The 3 and 4-year-old take up is fine. It's high. It's well up in the high 90%.
Tim, sorry, can I ask you if is there a link between those communities where we're seeing the attainment gap and the take up?
I don't. To be honest, I don't know that, because what we get from the Department of Work and Pensions is we don't get ethnic data. We just get postcodes and we get names. So we don't know the ethnicities of those who are taking up their free entitlement and those who are not at 2.
But it might be worth thinking about the points that have been raised by Sudhanesh, but also just what you were saying about early years. Well, I just wonder whether if we can utilise our community groups a bit more effectively to get that message out there about, maybe we could infer that it is those groups. If we are seeing disadvantage at the early years stage, you think that there might be some disparities there in terms of what they've received up until that point. I'm not sure.
No, it's a good question. And we get postcodes, so we can map them. So we know where they are in Hackney. We can see where, if they're in the north of the borough in Stamford Hill and they've got a name, you can generally say, well, that probably a Haredi family. But we don't get any more data than that. But I completely agree with you. It's about working with communities and saying, can you help us talk to the families and see if you can encourage them to take up the provision. The space is there, there's availability.
I've got quite a few people still want to ask questions. So
can I bring in Jason, Chair? Because he
yes, but we're probably not going to be able to have 3 people answering questions going forward. So I'm really sorry. We're going to have to just choose one, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Okay, I'll go then. I'll just make 2 very quick points. Completely agree with getting it right in the early years, but let's remember that in other countries, children don't actually start learning to read until the age of 7. In this country, it's when they get into year 1, and front-loading support in year 1 through that project reader. And actually listening to you, we should probably double down on that and do more. So that is something that could come out of tonight. Just wanted to address your question about some of the schools that are performing well and those that are underperforming, especially with key groups. Agree with Paul, we're working towards a much more school supporting school system, because we have a lot of talent and success in the schools, as you've seen, but that's already happening now. We run a supported schools program. We've got a number of primaries receiving support from, and actually some secondaries as well, from other school leaders where we've identified good practice. So find the pockets, test that it's good, and then set up that school to school support as well. That is already happening now.
Thank you very much. I've got, I think, Anya and then Lynn, and then we've got Andy and Stephen, and then I think that's it for this item, I think.
It was as much a comment as anything else, but really, really interesting to hear about the focus on self-regulation, so that whole SEMH focus, and a real plea to keep that at the top of the agenda, because it's not just for special needs kids, it's not just for those children coming through the pandemic, it's absolutely vital to everything. So please keep that focus, it's so important. And I just was wondering if there is any data about the links between attainment and SEMH and the work that you've been doing around self-regulation yet. But thank you.
Lynn, did you want to?
Thank you. It was just, you know, around the underperforming children, that the issues in every community are very different. So it was really good to hear that you have actually made an appointment to, you know, analyse the needs of those specific groups of people. And I think that parent engagement is absolutely key, you know. I can't overemphasize that, but really my question now is, because the gap seems to be getting worse, you know, as you go up the key stages, how is the authority working with academies? Because most of our secondary schools are academies, so how is the authority actually managing that? And, you know, are they, you know, are there pockets of good practice that, you know, are being shared between secondary schools regardless of their status? Thank you.
The local authority works very effectively with our academies. Our academies come to our head teacher events, they come to our network meetings. We can always go further, we could always be doing more. So I don't want to turn this into a maintained sector versus an academy sector conversation, or even the faith-based schools. We have many. We're a broad church when it comes to the education system in Hackney. I have 81 schools within our system, all made up of different shapes and sizes and different destinations. So the academies have an important part to play as part of our system, and they do engage, and the results for the academy schools compare quite favourably as well. So there are many strengths within the system, but you're absolutely right to challenge how well are all parts of the sector engaged. When we put on events and meetings, they do engage as best as possible. I don't know, Jason or Anton, would either of you have a comment on that? Because you do a lot of work in this space.
Just some immediate examples. We have 2 academies separately working, each with our 2 Orthodox Jewish secondary schools. Actually, one of those is an academy, the other one is a maintained school. So that's one example. We also have a secretary heads forum that's chaired by an academy leader. And increasingly, at head teacher conferences, we have head teacher panels and pupil panels to share the practice and the evolving new ground, the innovations. Tomorrow morning, I have an advisor presenting to Amazon on the back of the roadshow that we ran last week. And the roadshow last week was about engaging with alternative providers and local employers to kind of broaden the choice. And the reason for that is that impacts and influences on people designing the curriculum and running the schools. So we're doing that. And then on Wednesday, we have at sixth form, they're emulating what the secondary schools do. So on Wednesday morning, we have heads of sixth form doing a peer walkabout. Later in the year, and the agenda for that actually is about how do you build a strong sixth form and what does inclusive teaching look like at post 16. And then later in the term, this is an illustration of where the schools want to learn from each other. It's where the head at Urswick gets his chance to visit an academy. Don't worry, Richard, the red carpet's getting ready. Okay. Yeah, we encourage the schools. This is their agenda. We facilitate it, and the sharing and exchange of practice and insight works best when they want to do it, you know, on their own steam. It's also a good thing for one head to see another head in his or her own home, and the pride that kind of emanates just is catchy.
Just briefly, if I can just add something on that point around our engagement with parents, I think we all recognise that that's integral too. If you've got really great initiatives happening in schools that engage parents, if the schools aren't very good at engaging the parents, then that initiative is not going to work as well as it possibly could. What's been interesting for me as a parent of a child in reception, I'm seeing lots of disparities across the borough in terms of the way that parents are engaged with schools. Without naming names, there are some schools that use, I'm talking about not of schools, but of, we're using apps, quite a few different schools are using apps to connect with parents, which I think actually can be quite positive, because a lot of parents, even those who don't speak English as a first language, are quite fluent in translating text on their phones, and that can be a bit easier to do than translating the text from a letter that is sent home, not to mention the benefits in terms of the environment. So I just wonder if there's any, not just looking at what the schools are doing to bridge the gap, but also in terms of initiatives, but what the schools are doing to connect with parents, such as what Sudnes was saying about having a sort of nominated person in the school who communicated with the Turkish and Kurdish families. Can we facilitate sharing best practice with schools around reaching parents?
If I miss anything, Jason will follow through. The answer, yes, we have a parent engagement system leader. We're very keen to look at and work with schools to understand how they're reaching out to parents. And a lot of it comes down to ethos and the development of kind of relationship-based approaches. I don't have a blueprint, this is what works in one school. What I do see, what I do know, is pretty much the tone and the approach is set by the principal, by the head. And there are journeys that those leaders need to take for them to reach that maturity and that level of confidence. My service and Jason's team are working with Hackney Young Futures, to give an example, where we're looking at the use of student voice and how in some schools, alongside student voice, parent voice is being increasingly used to kind of give feedback on how that school is seen by the parents to be performing.
Thank you very much. And finally, we've got Andy and Stephen, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of things, just to react to the comment just made by Anton. I've been in discussion with Deborah about how we might engage parents for whom English isn't the first language. I think one of the things that we've discussed is around having some sort of decentralized parent meetings, because of course there are cultural and confidence issues with some parents not wanting to engage in a wider setting with different parents. So looking at groups of parents, there might be maybe just a parents' evening for the Turkish parents only on a particular evening, where obviously they're comfortable with their peers in that sense. So that's one way to look at it. In our school, in my school in particular, we've got a high portion of Congolese parents. We do have someone who actually work with those parents. So I think that helps, and that's one way to deal with that. I think one of the questions I'd like to just put to the council, and this is around, I know we spoke about disadvantaged pupils and pupils from ethnic backgrounds where English is a barrier. Given the surplus capacity in the system at the moment, we do know at primary school level and certainly in secondary school, to what extent mobility impacts pupil progress, and what support is being put in place to support those who are getting into the system, not at the primary level or from reception, and to have that sort of continuity of education. So what support is being put in place to help those parents and to help schools in terms of sharing information to ensure that there is a successful and smooth transition once those students enter the system?
Sorry, and Stephen, before we...
Whilst I do not want to go into any ethnicity breakdown,
because I do believe every child should benefit from this. Okay. Do you want to speak loud? Which one works? What works? Much better? Hey, thank you for, again, I'll start again. So thank you for sharing the report. I don't want to go too much into demographic breakdown or ethnicity. But what I do want to say, I do believe every child should benefit from this in the borough. Regarding your program raising attainment, how do school promote this, and can they recommend this to students that those parents might not necessarily come forward? As per Joe's comment, is there a clear-cut guideline for establishments or learning facilities struggling in terms of knowledge sharing from what works and what doesn't work?
Okay, there's a couple of questions there. Tim, do you want to come on the pupil mobility one? That falls into your jurisdiction. Go on, share the love.
Yeah, I think just to take up Andy's point, we are definitely seeing more mobility when you have more place and you have a system that prioritizes parental choice. And I'm not making a comment about that. That's a good thing, but you will see a lot of movement. Just speaking for the primary phase, we're certainly hearing that from schools. And I think your point about we are supporting some schools and getting schools to support some schools with intake, with that kind of quick settling. But I think that is probably something that our parental engagement lead could lead on in a more focused way. And I think it's about identifying good practice and creating that sharing across schools. So thank you for that.
Is that both questions?
Chair, could I make a quick comment?
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Deputy Mayor Bramble?
Thank you, Chair. Just to build on what Jason was saying, and he made the point that I was going to raise as well. One of the things that I advocated for the service to employ a full-time parent worker was exactly this. It was to build on the good work that schools are doing, to facilitate some of that parental engagement, and actually to build the gap where sometimes parental engagement just needed a bit of more support. So the comments that you and Scrutiny members have raised have been really helpful, and I'll make sure I feed that back. It used to be Deborah's role. She's gone on to another role around leading around inclusions and charters, but the new person definitely lays with them on this. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And I have to say, it was really encouraging to hear, Jason, some of the actually what's going on the ground in the schools, the real targeted efforts. And I really look forward to hearing about what we feel the outcome of those sort of efforts have been, really. So yeah, I think we're gonna have to move on from that item. I'm really sorry, guys, we've gone over again. So thank you all for contributing to that and for your detailed report. So item 6, which is the work programme. The work programme for the remainder of the municipal year is contained at page 85 of the agenda report pack. There is just one formal meeting remaining for the Commission on April the 17th, 2023, where there will be 2 substantive items. The first item is access to CAMS. To support this item, a focus group with representatives from local CAM services is being held this Wednesday, 22nd of March at 6:30 online. All members of the Commission can attend this focus group, as it will provide an opportunity to discuss key issues about the accessibility of local CAM services. An outline of the session is being drafted. The Vice Chair and I also visited a number of local CAM settings on the 10th of March, and the key issues arising from this will also be sent to members ahead of the focus group. The second item is the Cabinet Q&A with Deputy Mayor Bramble. After consulting with members, the Commission has agreed to focus on 3 areas with the Deputy Mayor: the quality and outcomes of young Hackney work with schools, children in temporary accommodation, and children that go missing from care, especially unaccompanied asylum seeker children. And further updates: the housing support for care leavers Cabinet response is now being presented at the 24th of April Cabinet meeting. And the Cabinet response to the childhood food poverty and summit outcomes are expected towards the end of March, early April. Item 7, the minutes. Draft minutes of the meeting held on the 27th of February were published separately from the main agenda pack on the 15th of March. Did all members receive minutes? Great. Are there any matters arising? The only thing to note here is that the Commission agreed to write to Council would be setting out the key areas of SEND provision which have emerged from local scrutiny, which would be reflected in a finalised action plan. If members have issues that they wish to highlight, please email the scrutiny officer by the 24th of March. There is no other business. Meeting finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.